So I'm going to be reading from Paul's epistle to the Colossian church, chapter 1, verses 15 to 23. And it's headed, The Supremacy of the Son of God. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation, if you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. This is the word of the Lord. Praise be.
As Chrissy mentioned at the beginning of the service, we are beginning a course taking us from now to Easter, based on a book by Max Lucado called He Chose the Nails. And at the beginning of his book, Max Lucado makes the point that we often think of Lent as being about a time of giving up things. So people give up things like chocolate or alcohol or other things. And Max Lucado makes the point that over his course, what he wants us to do is not so much think about what we might give up, but more to think about what we actually are able to receive as a result of what Jesus did for us. And as Chrissy mentioned, the course has the overall title of He Chose the Nails. And it is basically all about the wonderful gifts that we can receive because Jesus was willing to give up so much on our behalf. I'm going to be focusing this morning on the first subject in the series, which is He chose to become one of us. In looking at this, I want to focus on Paul's words in Colossians 1 that Ian just read to us, verses 15 to 23, but particularly to focus on verse 19, which contains some very remarkable words. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, that is, in Jesus. Now, the first point I want to make is to see the necessity of becoming one of us. Some of you know that I have an identical twin brother who is called Roger. There we are with Roger's wife, Jean, and as you can see, the two of us do look very alike. And a few weeks ago, Judy and I were at Roger's house to celebrate the 50th birthday of Roger's son, who's called Richard. And while we were there enjoying the party, a little girl of about 8 or 9 came up to me and she said, "Hello, Roger." "I'm not Roger," I said. "Oh, yes, you are," she said. "No, I'm not. I'm really not, but you are." And this conversation, if you can call it a conversation, went on for a few minutes until fortunately Roger appeared and said, "Hello, Annabelle," and a look of shock and amazement across Annabelle's face. We could understand why Annabelle was confused. I look like Roger. I speak like Roger. I have the same mannerisms as Roger. We share the same interests. We have the same sense of humor. We enjoy the same sort of food, but I am not Roger. And if Annabelle thinks that in meeting me, she is meeting Roger, then she's sadly mistaken. Also, if Annabelle thinks that because she knows Roger, then she knows me, again, she is mistaken. Now, the point I want to make from this is that Jesus may talk like God. He might show us what God is like. He might demonstrate the priorities, concerns, and attitudes of God. He might even look like God. But if he's not God, then it cannot be said that we know God if we know Jesus Christ. If Jesus only shows us what God is like, then he was wrong when he said in John 10, verse 30, "I and the Father are one." And in John 14, verse 9, "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." If people are to be able to have a living and a personal relationship with Almighty God, then it is vital, isn't it, that Jesus wasn't just like God, but that he actually was God. If conversely, if God is to be accessible to ordinary human beings like us, then it is vital that Jesus didn't just look like a human being, didn't just act like a human being, but he really was a human being, with everything that being human entails. So it is absolutely vital that Jesus, the eternal and divine Son of God, the full member of the divine Trinity, it is vital that he became one of us. It is a mystery, isn't it? How could the eternal God become a human being? We don't understand how it can happen, but we know how important it is. And as Paul puts it in Colossians 1, verse 19, "For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in Jesus." In Jesus, we really can know God. We can have a personal relationship with God. The second point I want to make is to see the cost of becoming one of us. In his book, which is the basis of this Lent series, Max Lucado focuses on this particular point about what it cost Jesus to become a human being. He makes 3 points about what it cost Jesus to do this. And the first point he makes is that Jesus gave up living in eternity to living in time. In Colossians 1, verse 17, it says of Christ that he was before all things. In other words, the divine Son of God has existed for the whole of time. There is not a moment when he started to exist. He has always been there. He is the eternal. He is the great I am, the one who is not confined to the limits of time. But in becoming one of us, he became subject to time. He knew the limitations of time. He grew up as a child. He developed into a teenager. He became a young adult. As a human being, he was locked into time like we all are. He had to follow the hours of the day, the days of the week, and so on. He could not escape the restrictions that time put on him. Secondly, Max Lucado says Jesus gave up boundlessness to be confined by space. In Psalm 139, verses 7 to 8, David ponders on the fact that God is boundless. He is a God who is everywhere. He says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, well, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you're there." David is recognizing here that one of the aspects, the divine aspects of God's nature, is that in an extraordinary, mysterious way, God is everywhere all the time. The eternal God is not confined by time, neither is he confined by space. At any one time, God can be found in Chesterfield or China or at the North Pole. In becoming one of us, Jesus gave up that sense of being able to be anywhere at any time. Max Lucado puts it like this in his book. When God entered time and became a man, he who was boundless became bound, imprisoned by flesh, restricted by weary-prone muscles and eyelids. For more than 3 decades, his once limitless reach will be limited to the stretch of an arm, his speed checked by the pace of human feet. It was an enormous price to pay to become one of us. Now, the third point about the cost of becoming one of us is probably the highest price that Jesus had to pay. And that is that he gave up sinlessness in order to become sin for us. Some years ago, when our eldest daughter was about 7 or 8, Nicola was playing around and she fell off a low wall. Now, she wouldn't have hurt herself in the fall. It wasn't a hard fall, but unfortunately, she fell backwards into a bed of roses. And she got stuck amidst all the thorns of the roses. And it was a very painful and a very difficult task to free her, first of all, from the thorns, and then to try and gently pull each thorn that was embedded in her flesh out of her. In the Bible, after Adam and Eve sinned, God said in Genesis 3, verses 17 to 18, "Cursed is the ground because of you. I will produce thorns and thistles for you." What we see here actually is that thorns were the result of human sin. And this is a theme that comes out throughout the Bible, that as a result of human disobedience, there are thorns. Proverbs 22, verse 5 is a good example of this. In the paths of the wicked lie thorns and snares. Until I read Max Lucado's book, I'd not thought about the dreadful symbolism of the crown of thorns that was shoved onto the head of Jesus. It was something that was painful, of course, in itself, but actually was symbolic of Jesus bearing on his head the outcome of human sin. And it becomes even worse as it is expressed in that awful cry that Jesus did from the darkness. My God, why have you forsaken me?" This is the cry of a person who has given up his sinless condition in order, as Paul puts it in 2 Corinthians 5:21, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. What an incredible price it was, wasn't it, to pay in order to become one of us, to take upon himself the filth and the shame and the thorns of the world. And so we see something of the cost that Jesus was willing to pay in order to become one of us. This is the price of the gift that we are able to receive at Lent and over Easter. He gave up eternity to live in time. He gave up boundlessness to be confined by space. And he gave up sinlessness to become sin for us. Colossians 1:19, "For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in Jesus." God was pleased, but the cost was horrendous. And so we come to the third point I want to make, which is to see the reason for becoming one of us. Some of you may have heard this story before. I think I've probably told it before, but I'll tell it again. It comes out of a book called Tell My People I Love Them. And in this book, Clifford Hill, the author of the book, relates how one year he went to watch the Winter Olympics. And at the end of all the skiing events that he was watching on the mountainside, a group of people were returning back to their hotels and their accommodation. And he describes how a very large group of people were walking along a very narrow path in the snow. And on one side of the path, there was a sort of sheer mound of snow. On the other side of the path was a steep slope downhill leading to a precipice that dropped hundreds of feet into the valley floor below. The only thing that was protecting people walking along the path was one bit of rope that was tied to poles along the side of the path. And as the people walked along the path, suddenly they heard a terrified scream as a little girl slipped and fell and slid underneath the rope and began to slide down the slope towards the precipice. And all the people who were there on the path absolutely froze in horror as they saw this little girl's face and heard her scream. Suddenly a man leapt over the rope. He took enormous steps down the steep slope. He went past the girl. He somehow managed to stop on the edge of the precipice. Where he stopped, he turned round and he caught the girl. And then with enormous struggle, he managed to carry her back up the slope to safety. It emerged, of course, that the man who sprinted down that treacherous mountainside that day was the girl's father. And Clifford Hill comments in his book that the only person who loved the girl enough to risk everything for her was her father. If you want to know why Jesus was willing to pay such an enormous price in order to become one of us, and the words Christine quoted earlier in the service tell us the answer. For God so loved the world. The only answer that can adequately explain why Jesus became one of us, the only answer is love. Easter is all about the supreme, self-giving love of Christ. But of course there's more to it than that, isn't there? Easter is not just about an expression of self-giving love. It's about love that had a purpose. This becomes very clear in Colossians 1. Verse 19 says, "For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him." But that's not the end of the passage. Verse 20 goes on to say, "And through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, making peace through his blood shed on the cross." And verses 21 and 22 go on to talk about how we were once alienated from God, separated from him, but now we have been reconciled, we've been brought near to him, we've been given a living relationship with him. That was why Jesus became one of us, out of love to bring us to himself. Jesus paid the ultimate price of becoming one of us so that we could have a living and loving relationship with him. A relationship that would not be confined to this world, but a relationship that would have an eternal dimension to it. In a few moments, we're going to sing together a song which is entitled, "You Were the Word at the Beginning." I really like this song, but I have to say that I did, until recently, really struggle with one line in the song. I don't know if you can guess which line it was, but it was the one where it says, "You didn't want heaven without us." And to me, I always thought that sounds a bit arrogant. As if we're saying, "Oh yeah, well, God, you really needed us to be with you in heaven, didn't you? You were incomplete somehow without me being there." So I used to find it difficult to sing that. And then Barbara, we had it at a church meeting, and after the song, Barbara did a prayer. And in the prayer, she quoted the line of that song. And she did it not in an arrogant way, but it came over to me anyway as in a kind of surprised way. How amazing. God would actually want people like us in heaven. It's extraordinary. Would he really be willing to pay such a high price so that I could be with him in heaven? Would he do that, express the purpose of allowing us to enjoy a relationship with him in heaven that lasts forever? And I want to thank you, Bob, because you've enabled me to sing that song wholeheartedly now. Yeah, you were sitting there at the piano. It was great. And you helped me see that the line is sung not with arrogance, but as a humble and wonderful expression of amazement at the enormity of the love of God. Colossians 1 verse 19, "For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. It's only 11 words long, that sentence, but it says so much. It tells us that if we really want to know God, then Jesus has to be more than just like God. He has to do more than just demonstrate what are the things that God cares about. He has to be both God and a human being. He has to be both divine and human. Otherwise, God is always going to be out of reach, never quite attainable. And Jesus chose to become one of us because there was no other way of establishing that relationship. And he chose to become one of us at enormous cost to himself, from living in eternity to being confined by time, from being boundless to being limited by space, from being sinless to wearing a crown of thorns and becoming sin for us. And he did all of that because he loves each one of us so much. And he gave himself so that we could live with him forever. Over this Lent period, as we reflect on all that we have been given in Christ, may we be truly thankful. And may we love him who loved us first. In a moment, we're going to sing the words that I struggled with. You didn't want heaven without us. And as we sing them, let's do so with a deep sense of joy and a sense of surprise and humility, as we recognize that the living and holy God actually wanted to share his glory with people like us.